The Nightmare Lake, written by H.P. Lovecraft in 1919. There is a lake in distant Zan, beyond the wonted haunts of man, where broods alone in a hideous state, a spirit dead and desolate, a spirit ancient and unholy, heavy with fearsome melancholy, which from the waters dull and dense draws vapors cursed with pestilence. Around the banks of mire clay sprawl things offensive in decay, and curious birds that reach that shore are seen by mortals nevermore. Here shines by day the searing sun, on glassy wastes beheld by none, and here by night pale moonbeams flow into the deeps that yawn below. In nightmares only it is told what scenes beneath those beams unfold, what scenes too old for human sight lie sunken there in endless night. For those in those depths there only pace the shadows of a voiceless race. One midnight rodolent of ill, I saw that lake asleep and still, while in the lurid sky there rode a gibbous moon that glowed and glowed. I saw the stretching marshy shore, and the foul things those marshes bore, lizards and snakes convulsed and dying, ravens and vampires putrefying, all these and hovering o'er the dead, necrophagy that on them fed. And as the dreadful moon climbed high, frightening stars from out the sky, I saw the lake's dull water glow, till sunken things appeared below. There shone unnumbered fathoms down the towers of a forgotten town, the tarnished domes and mossy walls, weed-tangled spires and empty halls, deserted fanes and vaults of dread, and streets of gold uncoveted. These I beheld and saw beside a horde of shapeless shadows glide, a noxious horde, which to my glance seemed moving in a hideous dance round slimy sepulchres that lay beside a never-traveled way. Straight from those tombs a heaving rose that vexed the water's dull repose, while lethal shades of upper space howled at the moon's sardonic face. Then sank the lake within its bed, sucked down to caverns of the dead, till from the reeking new-stripped earth curled fotid fumes of noisome birth. Above the city, nigh uncovered, a monstrous dancing shadows hovered, when lo, there opt, with sudden stir, the portal of each sepulchre. No ear may learn, no tongue may tell, what nameless horror then befell. I see that lake, that moon a-grin, that city, and the things within. Walking, I pray that on that shore the Nightmare Lake may sink no more. Apostrophobos, written in 1918. In the midnight heavens burning, through ethereal deeps afar, I once watched with restless yearning an alluring aureate star, every eye aloft returning, gleamed nigh the Arctic car. Mystic waves of beauty blended with gorgeous golden rays, fantasies of bliss descended in a mirrored Elysian haze, and the lyre-born chords extended harmonies of Lydian lays. There, thought I, lie scenes of pleasure, where the free and blessed dwell, and each moment bears a treasure, freighted with a lotus spell, and there floats a liquid measure from the lute of Israfel. There, I told myself, were shining worlds of happiness unknown, peace and innocence entwining by the crowned virtue's throne. Men of light, their thoughts refining, purer, fairer than our own. Thus I must, when over the vision crept a red delirious change, hope dissolving to derision, beauty to distortion strange, hymnic chords in weird collision, spectral sights in endless range. Crimson burned the star of sadness, as behind the beams I peered. All was woe that seemed but gladness, ere my gaze with truth was seared. Cacodemons mirrored with madness, through a fevered flickering leered. Now I know the fiendish fable that the golden glitter bore. Now I shun the spangled sable that I watched and loved before. But the horror, set and stable, haunts my soul forevermore. Halloween in a Suburb by H.P. Lovecraft. Written in 1926. The steeples are white in the wild moonlight, and the trees have a silver glare. Past the chimneys high see the vampires fly, and the harpies of upper air that flutter and laugh and stare. For the village dead, to the moon outspread, never shone in the sunset's gleam, but grew out of the deep that the dead years keep, where the rivers of madness stream down the gulfs to a pit of dream. A chill wind weaves through the rows of sheaves in the meadows that shimmer pale, and comes to twine where the headstones shine, and the ghouls of the churchyard wail for harvests that fly and fail. Not a breath of the strange grey gods of change that tore from the past its own can quicken this hour when a spectral power spreads sleep over the cosmic throne and looses the vast unknown. So here again, stretch the vale and plain that moons long forgotten saw, and the dead leap gay in the pallid ray sprung out of tomb's black maw to shake all the world with awe. And all that the morn shall greet forlorn, the ugliness and the pest of rows where thick rise the stones and brick shall someday be with the rest, and brood with the shades unblessed. Then wild in the dark let the lemurs bark, and the leprous spires ascend, for new and old alike in the fold of horror and death are penned, for the hounds of time to rend. I'm thinking of making all next month a Lovecraft-themed month, If you're interested in that, please let me know in the comments below. Here is Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone, in a small boat with water and provisions, for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastnesses of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded, some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality, which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid, with the carcasses of decaying fish, and of other less describable things, which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing within sight, save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor had been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours, I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side, and afforded a slight shade
as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night, I slept but little, and the next day I made myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of fish was maddening, but I was much too concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon, I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent, which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into the immeasurable pit or canyon whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks, and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian depths where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression on its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived without a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom. winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping at my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting, for the most part, of conventionalized aquatic symbols, such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things that were unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible, across the intervening water on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs, whose subjects would have excited the envy of adorer. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shewn disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms, I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shewn in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into the past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing, whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm sometime after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder, and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god, but soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information, or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man of war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols, and carving their detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows, to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink, and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God! That hand! The window! The window! This is Nyarlathotep by H.P. Lovecraft, written in 1920. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger. A danger widespread and all-embracing. Such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that people went about with pale, worried faces and whispered warnings and prophecies, which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world, and perhaps the universe, had passed from the control of known gods, or forces, to that of gods, or forces which were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was none could tell, but he was of old native blood, and looked like a pharaoh. The fellahin knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal, and combining them into instruments yet stranger. He spoke much of the sciences, of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless, yet which swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. Men advised one another to see Nyarlathotep and shuddered, and where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare. Never before had the screams of nightmare been such a public problem. Now the wise men almost wished they had forbid sleep in the small hours, that the shrieks of the city might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon as it glimmered on green waters gliding under bridges, and old steeples crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city, The great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. My friend told me of him, and of the impelling fascination and allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. My friend said they were horrible, and impressive beyond my most fevered imaginings. That what was thrown on a screen in the darkened room prophesied things none but Nyarlathotep dared prophesy, and that in the sputter of his sparks there was taken from man that which had never been taken before, yet which shewed only in the eyes. And I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others saw not. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep, through the stifling night and up the endless stairs into the choking room. And shadowed on the screen, I saw hooded forms amidst ruins, and yellow, evil faces peering from behind fallen monuments. And I saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, and struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. Then the sparks played amazingly around the heads of the spectators, and hair stood up on end, whilst shadows more grotesque than I can tell came out and squatted on the heads. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drave us all out, down the dizzy stairs into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and the others screamed with me for solace. We swear to one another that the city was exactly the same, and still alive, and when the electric lights began to fade, we cursed the company over and over again, and laughed at the queer faces we made. I believe we felt something coming down from the greenish moon, for when we began to depend on its light, we drifted into curious involuntary formations, and seemed to know our destinations, though we dared not think of them. Once we looked at the pavement and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to shew where the tramways had run. And again we saw a tramcar, lone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. Then we split up in narrow columns, each of which seemed drawn in a different direction. One disappeared in a narrow alley to the left, leaving only the echo of a shocking moan. Another filed down a weed-choked subway entrance, howling with a laughter that was mad. My own column was sucked toward the open country, and presently felt a chill, which was not of the hot autumn. For as we stalked out on the dark moor, we beheld around us the hellish moon glitter of evil snows, trackless, inexplicable snows, swept asunder in one direction only, where lay a gulf, all the blacker for its glittering walls. The column seemed very thin indeed, as it plodded dreamily into the gulf. I lingered behind, for the black rift in the green-litten snow was frightful, and I thought I had heard the reverberations of a disquieting wail as my companions vanished. But my power to linger was slight. As if beckoned by those who had gone before, I half floated between the titanic snowdrifts, quivering and afraid, into the sightless vortex of the unimaginable. Screamingly sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods that were can tell. A sickened, sensitive shadow writhing in hands that were not hands, and whirling blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creation. Corpses of dead worlds with sores that were cities, charnel winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. Beyond the worlds, vague ghosts of monstrous things, half-seen columns of unsanctified temples that rest on nameless rocks beneath space and reach up to dizzy vacua above the spheres of light and darkness. And through this revolting graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beating of drums and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time, the detestable pounding and piping whereon to dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly the gigantic, tenebrous, ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep. The Statement of Randolph Carter by H.P. Lovecraft, written in 1919. I repeat to you, gentlemen, that your inquisition is fruitless. Detain me here forever if you will. Confine or execute me if you must have a victim to propitiate the illusion you call justice. But I can say no more than I have said already. Everything that I can remember, I have told with perfect candor. Nothing has been distorted or concealed, and if anything remains vague, it is only because of the dark cloud which has come over my mind. That cloud and the nebulous nature of the horrors which brought it upon me. Again, I say, I do not know what has become of Harley Warren, though I think, almost hope, that he is in peaceful oblivion, if there be anywhere so blessed a thing. It is true that I have for 5 years been his closest friend, and a partial sharer of his terrible researches into the unknown. I will not deny, though my memory is uncertain and indistinct, that this witness of yours may have seen us together, as he says, on the Gainesville Pike, walking toward Big Cypress Swamp at 11:30 on that awful night. That we bore electric lanterns, spades, and a curious coil of wire with attached instruments, I will even affirm, for these things all played a part in the single hideous scene which remains burned into my shaken recollection. But of what followed, and of the reason I was found alone and dazed on the edge of the swamp next morning, I must insist I know nothing save what I have told you over and over again. You say to me that there is nothing in the swamp, or near it, which could form the setting of that frightful episode. I reply that I know nothing beyond what I saw. Vision or nightmare it may have been. Vision or nightmare, I fervently hope it was. Yet it is still all that my mind retains of what took place in those shocking hours after we left the sight of men, and why Harley Warren did not return, he or his shade, or some nameless thing I cannot describe, alone can tell. As I have said before, the weird studies of Harley Warren were well known to me, and to some extent shared by me. Of his vast collection of strange rare books on forbidden subjects, I have read all that are written in languages of which I am master, but these are few as compared to those in languages I cannot understand. Most, I believe, are in Arabic, and the fiend-inspired book which brought on the end, the book which he carried in his pocket out of the world, was written in characters whose like I never saw elsewhere. Warren would never tell me just what was in that book. As to the nature of our studies, must I say again that I no longer retain full comprehension? It seems to me rather merciful that I do not, for they were terrible studies, which I pursued more through reluctant fascination than through actual inclination. Warren always dominated me, and sometimes I feared him. I remember how I shuddered at his facial expression on the night before the awful happening, when he talked so incessantly of his theory, why certain corpses never decay, but rest firm and fat in their tombs for thousands of years. But I do not fear him now, for I suspect he has known horrors beyond my ken. Now I fear for him. Once more I say that I have no clear idea of our object on that night. Certainly it had much to do with something in the book which Warren carried with him, that ancient book in undecipherable characters, which had come to him from India a month before. But I swear I do not know what it was that we expected to find. Your witness says he saw us at 11:30 on the Gainesville Pike, headed for Big Cypress Swamp. This is probably true, but I have no distinct memory of it. The picture seared into my soul is of one scene only, and the hour must have been long after midnight, for a waning crescent moon was high in the vaporous heavens. The place was an ancient cemetery, so ancient that I trembled at the manifold signs of immemorial years. It was in a deep, damp hollow, overgrown with rank grass, moss, and curious creeping weeds, and filled with a vague stench which my idle fantasy associated absurdly with rotting stone. On every hand were signs of neglect and decrepitude, and I seemed haunted by the notion that Warren and I were the first living creatures to invade a lethal silence of centuries. Over the valley's rim, a wan, waning crescent moon peered through the noisome vapors that seemed to emanate from unheard-of catacombs, and by its feeble wavering beams I could distinguish a repellent array of antique slabs, urns, cenotaphs, and mausolean facades, all crumbling, moss-grown and moisture-stained, and partially concealed by the gross luxuriance of the unhealthy vegetation. My first vivid impression of my own presence in this terrible necropolis concerns the act of pausing with Warren before a certain half-obliterated sepulchre, and of throwing down some burdens which we seemed to have been carrying. I now observed that I had with me an electric lantern and 2 spades, whilst my companion was supplied with a similar lantern and a portable telephone outfit. No word was uttered, for the spot and the task seemed known to us, and without delay we seized our spades and commenced to clear away the grass, weeds, and drifted earth from the flat, archaic mortuary. After uncovering the entire surface, which consisted of 3 immense granite slabs, we stepped back some distance to survey the charnel scene, and Warren appeared to make some mental calculations. Then he returned to the sepulchre and, using his spade as a lever, sought to pry up the slab lying nearest to a stony ruin, which may have been a monument in its day. He did not succeed and motioned to me to come to his assistance. Finally, our combined strength loosened the stone, which we raised and tipped to one side. The removal of the slab revealed a black aperture, from which rushed an effluence of miasmal gases so nauseous that we started back in horror. After an interval, however, we approached the pit again and found the exhalations less unbearable. Our lanterns disclosed the top of a flight of stone stairs, dripping with some detestable ichor of inner earth and bordered by moist walls, encrusted with niter. And now, for the first time, my memory records verbal discourse. Warren, addressing me at length in his mellow tenor voice, a voice singularly unperturbed by our awesome surroundings. "I'm sorry to have to ask you to stay on the surface," he said, "but it would be a crime to let anyone with your frail nerves go down there. You can't imagine, even from what you have read and from what I've told you, the things I shall have to see and do. It's fiendish work, Carter, and I doubt if Any man without ironclad sensibilities could ever see it through and come up alive and sane. I don't wish to offend you, and heaven knows I'd be glad enough to have you with me, but the responsibility is in a certain sense mine, and I couldn't drag a bundle of nerves like you down to probable death or madness. I tell you, you can't imagine what the thing is really like, but I promise to keep you informed over the telephone of every move. You see, I've enough wire here to reach to the center of the earth and back. I can still hear, in memory, those coolly spoken words, and I can still remember my remonstrances. I seemed desperately anxious to accompany my friend into those sepulchral depths, yet he proved inflexibly obdurate. At one time, he threatened to abandon the expedition if I remained insistent, a threat which proved effective since he alone held the key to the thing. All this I can still remember, though I no longer know what manner of thing we sought. After he secured my reluctant acquiescence in his design, Warren picked up the reel of wire and adjusted the instruments. At his nod, I took one of the latter and seated myself upon an aged, discolored gravestone close by the newly uncovered aperture. Then he shook my hand, shouldered the coil of wire, and disappeared within the indescribable ossuary. For a moment I kept sight of the glow of his lantern, and heard the rustle of the wire as he laid it down after him. But the glow soon disappeared abruptly, as if a turn in the staircase had been encountered, and the sound died away almost as quickly. I was alone, yet bound to the unknown depths by those magic strands, whose insulated surface lay green beneath the struggling beams of the waning crescent moon. In the long silence of that hoary and deserted city of the dead, my mind conceived the most ghastly fantasies and illusions, and the grotesque shrines and monoliths seemed to assume a hideous personality, a half-sentience. Amorphous shadows seemed to lurk in the darker recesses of the weed-choked hollow, and to flit as in some blasphemous ceremonial procession past the portals of the moldering tombs in the hillside. Shadows which could not have been cast by that pallid peering crescent moon. I constantly consulted my watch by the light of my electric lantern, and listened with feverish anxiety at the receiver of the telephone, but for more than a quarter of an hour heard nothing. Then a faint clicking came from the instrument, and I called down to my friend in a tense voice. Apprehensive as I was nevertheless unprepared for the words which came up from the uncanny vault in accents more alarmed and quivering than any I had heard before from Harley Warren. He, who had so calmly left me a little while previously, now called from below, in a shaky whisper more portentous than the loudest shriek.
God, if you could see what I am seeing!
I could not answer. Speechless, I could only wait. Then came the frenzied tones again.
Carter, it's terrible. Monstrous. Unbelievable.
This time, my voice did not fail me, and I poured into the transmitter a flood of excited questions. Terrified, I continued to repeat, "Warren, what is it? What is it?" Once more came the voice of my friend, still hoarse with fear, and now apparently tinged with despair.
I can't tell you, Carter. It's too utterly beyond thought. I dare not tell you. No man could know it and live. Pray God, I never dreamed of this.
Stillness again, save for my new incoherent torrent of shuddering inquiry. Then the voice of Warren, in a pitch of wilder consternation.
Carter, for the love of God, put back the slab and get out of this if you can. Quick, leave everything else and make for the outside. It's your only chance. Do as I say, and don't ask me to explain.
I heard, yet was able only to repeat my frantic questions. Around me were the tombs, and the darkness and the shadows. Below me some peril beyond the radius of human imagination. But my friend was in greater danger than I, and through my fear, I felt a vague resentment that he should deem me capable of deserting him under such circumstances. More clicking, and after a pause, a piteous cry from Warren.
Beat it. For God's sake, put back the slab and beat it, Carter.
Something in the boyish slang of my evidently stricken companion unleashed my faculties. I formed and shouted a resolution. Warren, brace up, I'm coming down. But at this offer, the tone of my auditor changed to a scream of utter despair.
Don't. You can't understand. It's too late and my own fault. Put back the slab and run. There's nothing else you or anyone can do now.
The tone changed again, this time acquiring a softer quality as of hopeless resignation, yet it remained tense through anxiety for me.
Quick, before it's too late.
I tried not to heed him, tried to break through the paralysis which held me, and to fulfill my vow to rush down to his aid. But his next whisper found me still held inert in the chains of stark horror.
Carter, hurry. It's no use. You must go. Better one than two. The slab.
A pause, more clicking than the faint voice of Warren.
Nearly over now. Don't make it harder. Cover up those damned steps and run for your life. You're losing time. So long, Carter. Won't see you again.
Here, Warren's whisper swelled into a cry that gradually rose to a shriek, fraught with all the horror of the ages.
Curse these hellish things, legions. My God. Beat it, beat it, beat it.
After that was silence. I know not how many interminable eons I sat stupefied, whispering, muttering, calling, screaming into that telephone. Over and over again through those eons I whispered and muttered, called, shouted, and screamed. Warren, Warren, answer me. Are you there? And then there came to me the crowning horror of all, the unbelievable, unthinkable, almost unmentionable thing. I have said that eons seemed to elapse after Warren shrieked forth his last despairing warning, and that only my cries now broke the hideous silence. But after a while, there was further clicking in the receiver, and I strained my ears to listen. Again I called down, Warren, are you there? And in answer heard the thing which has brought this cloud over my mind. I do not try, gentlemen, to account for that thing, that voice, nor can I venture to describe it in detail, since the first words took away my consciousness and created a mental blank which reaches to the time of my awakening in the hospital. Shall I say that the voice was deep, hollow, gelatinous, remote, unearthly, inhuman, disembodied? What shall I say? It was the end of my experience, and is the end of my story. I heard it, and knew no more. Heard it as I sat petrified in that unknown cemetery in the hollow. Amidst the crumbling stones and falling tombs, the rank vegetation and the miasmal vapors, heard it well up from the innermost depths of that damnable open sepulchre, as I watched amorphous, necrophagous shadows dance beneath an accursed, waning moon. And this is what it said.
You fool. Born is dead.
The Beast in the Cave by H.P. Lovecraft. This story was written in 1905. The horrible conclusion, which had been gradually obtruding itself upon my confused and reluctant mind, was now an awful certainty. I was lost, completely, hopelessly lost in the vast and labyrinthian recesses of the Mammoth Cave. Turn as I might, in no direction could my straining vision seize on any object capable of serving as a guidepost to set me on the outward path, that never more should I behold the blessed light of day or scan the pleasant hills and dales of the beautiful world outside. My reason could no longer entertain the slightest unbelief. Hope had departed, yet indoctrinated as I was by a life of philosophical study, I derived no small measure of satisfaction from my unimpassioned demeanor. For although I had frequently read of the wild frenzies into which were thrown the victims of similar situations, I experienced none of these, but stood quiet as soon as I clearly realized the loss of my bearings. Nor did the thought that I had probably wandered beyond the utmost limits of ordinary search cause me to abandon my composure, even for a moment. If I must die, I reflected, then was this terrible yet majestic cavern as welcome a sepulchre as that which any churchyard might afford? A conception which carried with it more of tranquility than of despair. Starving would prove my ultimate fate. Of this I was certain. Some, I knew, had gone mad under circumstances such as these, but I felt that this end would not be mine. My disaster was the result of no fault save my own, since unbeknown to the guide, I had separated myself from the regular party of sightseers, and, wandering for over an hour in forbidden avenues of the cave, had found myself unable to retrace the devious windings which had pursued since forsaking my companions. Already my torch had begun to expire. Soon I would be enveloped by total and almost palpable blackness of the bowels of the earth. As I stood in the waning unsteady light, I idly wondered over the exact circumstance of my coming end. I remembered the account which I had heard of the colony of consumptives, who, taking their residence in this gigantic grotto to find health from the apparently salubrious air of the underground world, with its steady uniform temperature, pure air, and peaceful quiet, had found instead death in strange and ghastly form. I had seen the sad remains of their ill-made cottages as I passed them by with the party, and had wondered what unnatural influence a long sojourn into this immense and silent cavern would exert upon one as healthy and vigorous as I. Now, I grimly told myself, my opportunity for setting this point had arrived, provided that want of food should not bring me to a speedy departure from this life. As the last fitful rays of my torch faded into obscurity, I resolved to leave no stone unturned, no possible means of escape neglected. So, summoning all the powers possessed by my lungs, I set up a series of loud shoutings in the vain hope of attracting the attention of the guide by my clamor. Yet as I called, I believe in my heart that my cries were made to no purpose, and that my voice, magnified and reflected by the numberless ramparts of the black maze about me, fell upon no ears save my own. All at once, however, My attention was fixed with a start, as I fancied that I heard the sound of soft approaching steps on the rocky cavern floor. Was my deliverance about to be accomplished so soon? And was the guide, having marked my unwarranted absence from the party, following my course and seeking me out in this limestone labyrinth? Whilst these joyful queries arose in my brain, I was on the point of renewing my cries, in order that my discovery might come the sooner, when in an instant my delight was turned to horror as I listened. For my ever-acute ear, now sharpened in even greater degree by the complete silence of the cave, bore to my benumbed understanding the unexpected and dreadful knowledge that these footfalls were not like those of any mortal man. In the unearthly stillness of the subterranean region, the tread of the booted guide would have sounded like a series of sharp and incisive blows. These impacts were soft and stealthy, as of the padded paws of some feline. Besides, at times, when I listened carefully, I seemed to trace the falls of 4 instead of 2 feet. I was now convinced that I had, by my cries, aroused and attracted some wild beast, perhaps a mountain lion which had accidentally strayed within the cave. Perhaps, I considered, the Almighty had chosen for me a swifter and more merciful death than that of hunger. Yet the instinct of self-preservation, never wholly dormant, was stirred in my breast, and though escape from the oncoming peril might but spare me from a sterner and more lingering end, I determined nevertheless to part with my life at as high a price as I could command. Strange as it may seem, my mind conceived of no intent on the part of the visitor save that of hostility. Accordingly, I became very quiet, in the hope that the unknown beast would, in the absence of a guiding sound, lose its direction as had I, and thus pass me by. But this hope was not destined for realization, for the strange footfalls steadily advanced, the animal evidently having obtained my scent, which in an atmosphere so absolutely free from all distracting influences as is that of a cave, could doubtless be followed at great distance. Seeing, therefore, that I must be armed for defense against an uncanny and unseen attack in the dark, I grouped about me the largest of the fragments of rock, which was strewn upon all parts of the floor of the cavern in the vicinity, and, grasping one in each hand for immediate use, awaited with resignation the inevitable result. Meanwhile, the hideous pattering of the paws drew near. Certainly the conduct of the creature was exceedingly strange. Most of the time the tread seemed to be that of a quadruped, walking with a singular lack of unison betwixt hind and 4 feet. Yet at brief and infrequent intervals, I fancied that but 2 feet were engaged in the process of locomotion. I wondered what species of animal was to confront me. It must, I thought, be some unfortunate beast who had paid for its own curiosity to investigate one of the entrance of the fearful grotto, with a lifelong confinement in its interminable recesses. It doubtless obtained as food the eyeless fish, bats, and rats of the cave, as well as some of the ordinary fish that are wafted in at every freshet of Green River, which communicates in some occult manner with the waters of the cave. I occupied my terrible vigil with grotesque conjectures of what alterations cave life might have wrought in the physical structure of the beast, remembering the awful appearances ascribed by local tradition to the consumptives who had died after a long residence in the cavern. Then I remembered with a start that, even should I succeed in killing my antagonist, I should never behold its form, as my torch had long since been extinct, and I was entirely unprovided with matches. The tension on my brain now became frightful, My disordered fancy conjured up hideous and fearsome shapes from the sinister darkness that surrounded me, and that actually seemed to press upon my body. Nearer and nearer the dreadful footfalls approached. It seemed that I must give vent to a piercing scream, yet had I been sufficiently irresolute to attempt such a thing, my voice could scarce have responded. I was petrified, rooted to the spot. I doubted if my right arm would allow me to hurl its missile at the oncoming thing when the crucial moment should arrive. Now the steady pat, pat of the steps was close at hand. Now, very close. I could hear the labored breathing of the animal. And terror-struck as I was, I realized that it must have come from a considerable distance, and was correspondingly fatigued. Suddenly the spell broke. My right hand, guided by my ever-trusty sense of hearing, threw with full force the sharp-angled bit of limestone, which it contained, toward the point in darkness from which emanated the breathing and pattering. And, wonderful to relate, it nearly reached its goal, for I heard the thing jump, landing at a distance away, where it seemed to pause. Having readjusted my aim, I discharged my second missile, this time most effectively. With a flood of joy I listened as the creature fell in what sounded like a complete collapse, and evidently remained prone and unmoving. Almost overpowered by the great relief which rushed over me, I reeled back against the wall. The breathing continued, in heavy, gasping inhalations and expirations, whence I realized that I had no more than wounded the creature. And now all desire to examine the thing ceased. At last something allied to groundless, superstitious fear had entered my brain, and I did not approach the body, nor did I continue to cast stones at it in order to complete the extinction of its life. Instead, I ran at full speed in what was, as near as I could estimate in my frenzied condition, the direction from which I had come. Suddenly, I heard a sound, or rather, a regular succession of sounds. In another instant, they had resolved themselves into a series of sharp metallic clicks. This time, there was no doubt. It was the guide. And then I shouted, yelled, screamed, even shrieked with joy, as I beheld the vaulted arches above the faint and glimmering engulfants, which I knew to be the reflected light of an approaching torch. I ran to meet the flare, and before I could completely understand what had occurred, was lying upon the ground at the feet of the guide, embracing his boots and gibbering despite my boasted reserve, in a most meaningless and idiotic manner, pouring out my terrible story, and at the same time overwhelming my auditor with protestations of gratitude. At length, I awoke to something like my normal consciousness. The guide had noted my absence upon the arrival of the party at the entrance of the cave, and had, from his own intuitive sense of direction, proceeded to make a thorough canvass of the by-passages just ahead of where he'd last spoken to me, locating my whereabouts after a quest of about 4 hours. By the time he had related this to me, I, emboldened by his torch and his company, began to reflect upon the strange beast which I had wounded but a short distance back in the darkness, and suggested that we ascertain, by the rushlight's aid, what manner of creature was my victim. Accordingly, I retraced my steps, this time with a courage born of companionship, to the scene of my terrible experience. Soon we descried a white object upon the floor, an object whiter even than the gleaming limestone itself. Cautiously advancing, we gave vent to a simultaneous ejaculation of wonderment, for of all the unnatural monsters either of us had in our lifetimes beheld, this was, in surpassing degree, the strangest. It appeared to be an anthropoid ape of large proportions, escaped perhaps from some itinerant menagerie, Its hair was snow white, a thing due no doubt to the bleaching action of the long existence within the inky confines of the cave. But it was also surprisingly thin, being indeed largely absent, save on the head, where it was of such length and abundance that it fell over the shoulders in considerable profusion. The inclination of the limbs was very singular, explaining however the alteration in their use which I had before noted, whereby the beast used sometimes all four, and on other occasions but two for its progress. From the tips of the fingers or toes, long nail-like claws extended. The hands or feet were not prehensile, a fact that I ascribed to the long residence in the cave, which, as before mentioned, seemed evident from all the pervading and almost unearthly whiteness so characteristic of the whole anatomy. No tail seemed to be present. The respiration had now grown very feeble. The guide had drawn his pistol with evident intent of dispatching the creature, when a sudden sound emitted by the latter caused the weapon to fall, unused. The sound was of a nature difficult to describe. It was not like the normal note of any known species of simian, and I wondered if this unnatural quality were not the result of a long-continued and complete silence, broken by the sensations produced by the advent of the light, a thing which the beast could not have seen since its first entrance into the cave. The sound, which I might feebly attempt to classify as a kind of deep-toned chattering, was faintly continued. All at once, a fleeting spasm of energy seemed to pass through the frame of the beast. The paws went through a convulsive motion, and the limbs contracted. With a jerk, the white body rolled over so that its face was turned in our direction. For a moment I was so struck with horror at the eyes thus revealed that I noted nothing else. They were black, those eyes. Deep, jetty black, in hideous contrast to the snow-white hair and flesh. Like other cave denizens, they were deeply sunken into their orbits, and they were entirely destitute of iris. As I looked more closely, I saw that they were set in a face less prognathous than the average ape and infinitely more hairy. The nose was quite distinct. As we gazed upon the uncanny sight presented to our vision, the thick lips opened and several sounds issued from them, after which the thing relaxed in death. The guide clutched my coat sleeve and trembled so violently that the light shook fitfully, casting weird moving shadows on the walls about us. I made no motion, but stood rigidly still, my horrified eyes fixed upon the floor ahead. Then fear left, and wonder, awe, compassion, and reverence succeeded in its place, for the sounds uttered by the stricken figure that lay stretched out on the limestone had told us the awesome truth. The creature I had killed, the strange beast of the unfathomed cave, was, or had at one time been, a man. Huge thanks to my friend, Tales of Tim. You guys should like, favorite, and subscribe to his channel. Hit the notification button if you want to see anything new from him. Sorry that this one's coming to you guys from a different voice. I guarantee you he would have done amazing with this one. But considering his voice is going out, I thought I'd help him out a bit. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and please, come over to my channel if you'd like. I'm the Right Hand of Doom. And as I like to say on my channel, sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.
The Book by H.P. Lovecraft, written in 1933. My memories are very confused. There is even much doubt as to where they begin, for at times I feel appalling vistas of years stretching behind me, while at other times it seems as if the present moment were an isolated point in a gray, formless infinity. I am not even certain how I am communicating this message. While I know I am speaking, I have a vague impression that some strange and perhaps terrible meditation will be needed to bear what I say to the points where I wish to be heard. My identity, too, is bewilderingly cloudy. I seem to have suffered a great shock, perhaps from some utterly monstrous outgrowth of my cycles of unique, incredible experience. These cycles of experience, of course, all stem from that worm-riddled book. I remember when I found it, in a dimly lighted place near the black, oily river where the mists always swirl. That place was very old, and the ceiling-high shelves full of rotting volumes reached back endlessly through windowless inner rooms and alcoves. There were, besides, great, formless heaps of books on the floor and in crude bins, and it was in one of those heaps that I found the thing. I never learned its title, for the early pages are missing, but it fell open toward the end and gave me a glimpse of something that sent my senses reeling. There was a formula, a sort of list of things to say and do, which I recognized as something black and forbidden, something which I had read before in furtive paragraphs of mixed abhorrence and fascination, penned by those strange, ancient delvers into the universe's guarded secrets, whose decaying texts I loved to absorb. It was a key, a guide, to certain gateways and transitions of which mystics have dreamed and whispered since the race was young, and which led to freedoms and discoveries beyond the 3 dimensions and realms of life and matter that we know. Not for centuries had any man recalled its vital substance or known where to find it, but this book was very old indeed. No printing press, but the hands of some half-crazed monk had traced these ominous Latin phrases in uncials of awesome antiquity. I remember how the old man leered and tittered and made a curious sign with his hand when I bore it away. He had refused to take pay for it, and only long afterward did I guess why. As I hurried home through those narrow, winding, mist-choked waterfront streets, I had a frightful impression of being stealthily followed by softly padding feet. The centuried, tottering houses on both sides seemed alive with a fresh and morbid malignity, as if some hitherto closed channel of evil understanding had abruptly been opened. I felt those walls and overhanging gables of mildewed brick and fungus plaster and timber, with fishy, eye-like diamond-paned windows that leered, could hardly desist from advancing and crushing me. Yet I had read only the least fragment of that blasphemous rune before closing the book and bringing it away. I remember how I read the book at last, white-faced and locked in the attic room that I had long devoted to strange searchings. The great house was very still, for I had not gone up till after midnight. I think I had a family then, though the details are very uncertain, and I know there were many servants. Just what the year was, I cannot say, for since I have known many ages and dimensions, and have had all my notions of time dissolved and refashioned. It was by the light of candles that I read. I recall the relentless dripping of the wax, and there were chimes that came every now and then from distant belfries. I seemed to keep track of those chimes with a peculiar intentness, as if I feared to hear some very remote, intruding note among them. Then came the first scratching and fumbling at the dormer window that looked out high above the other roofs of the city. It came as I droned aloud the 9th verse of that primal lay, and I knew amidst my shudders what it meant, for he who passes the gateways always wins a shadow, and never again can he be alone. I had evoked, and the book was indeed all I had suspected. That night, I passed the gateway to a vortex of twisted time and vision, and when morning found me in the attic room, I saw in the walls and shelves and fittings that which I had never seen before. Nor could I ever after see the world as I had known it. Mixed with the present scene was always a little of the past and a little of the future, and every once familiar object loomed alien in a new perspective brought on by my widened sight. From then on, I walked in a fantastic dream of unknown and half-known shapes, and with each new gateway crossed, the less plainly could I recognize the things of the narrow sphere to which I had so long been bound. What I saw about me, none else saw, and I grew doubly silent and aloof, lest I be thought mad. Dogs had fear of me, for they felt the outside shadow which never left my side. But still I read more, in hidden forgotten books and scrolls, to which my new vision led me, and pushed through fresh gateways of space and being and life patterns toward the core of the unknown cosmos. I remember the night I made 5 concentric circles of fire on the floor, and stood in the innermost one chanting that monstrous litany the messenger from Tartary had brought. The walls melted away, and I was swept by a black wind through gulfs of fathomless gray, with the needle-like pinnacles of unknown mountains miles below me. After a while, there was utter blackness, and then the light of myriad stars forming strange, alien constellations. Finally, I saw a green-litten plain far below me, and discerned on it the twisted towers of a city built in no fashion I had ever known, or read of, or dreamed of. As I floated closer to that city, I saw a great square building of stone in an open space, and felt a hideous fear clutching at me. I screamed and struggled, and after a blackness was again in my attic room, sprawled flat over the 5 phosphorescent circles on the floor. In that night's wandering there was no more of strangeness than in my former night's wandering, but there was more of terror, because I knew I was closer to those outside gulfs and worlds than I had ever been before. Thereafter I was more cautious with my incantations, for I had no wish to be cut off from my body, and from the earth in unknown abysses whence I could never return.
The Doom That Came to Sarnath by H.P. Lovecraft, written in 1920. There is in the land of Mnar a vast lake that is fed by no stream, and out of which no stream flows. 10,000 years ago, there stood by its shore the mighty city of Sarnath, but Sarnath stands there no more. It is told that in the immemorial years when the world was young, before ever the men of Sarnath came to the land of Mnar, another city stood beside the lake, the grey stone city of Ib, which was old as the lake itself, and peopled with beings not pleasing to behold. Very odd and ugly were these beings, as indeed are most beings of a world yet inchoate and rudely fashioned. It is written on the brick cylinders of Cathedron that the beings of Ib were in hue as green as the lake, and the mists that rise above it, that they had bulging eyes, pouting, flabby lips, and curious ears, and were without voice. It is also written that they descended one night from the moon in a mist, they and the vast still lake, and the grey stone city of Ib. However this may be, it is certain that they worshipped a sea-green stone idol, chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug, the great water lizard, before which they danced horribly when the moon was gibbous. And it is written in the papyrus of Larnek that they one day discovered fire, and thereafter kindled flames on many ceremonial occasions. Not much is written of these beings, because they lived in very ancient times, and man is young, and knows little of the very ancient living things. After many eons, men came to the land of Mnar, dark shepherd folk with their fleecy flocks, who built Thra, Larnek, and Cathedron on the winding river Ai, and certain tribes, more hardy than the rest, pushed on to the border of the lake, and built Sarnath at a spot where precious metals were found in the earth. Not far from the great city of Ib did the wandering tribes lay the first stones of Sarnath, but with their marveling was mixed hate, for they thought it not meet that beings of such aspect should walk about the world of men at dusk. Nor did they like the strange sculptures upon the grey monoliths of Ib, for those sculptures were terrible, with great antiquity. Why the beings and sculptures lingered so late in the world, even until the coming of men, none can tell, unless it was because the land of Mnar is very still, and remote from most other lands, both of waking and of dream. As the men of Sarnath beheld more of the beings of Ib, their hate grew, and it was not less because they found the beings weak and soft as jelly to the touch of stones and spears and arrows. So one day, the young warriors, the slingers and the spearmen and the bowmen, marched against Ib and slew all the inhabitants thereof, pushing the queer bodies into the lake with long spears, because they did not wish to touch them, and because they did not like the grey sculptured monoliths of Ib, they cast these also into the lake, wondering from the greatness of the labor however the stones were brought from afar, as they must have been, since there is naught like them in all the land of Mnar, or in the lands adjacent. Thus, of the very ancient city of Ib was nothing spared, save the sea-green stone idol, chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug, the water lizard. This the young warriors took back with them to Sarnath, as a symbol of conquest over the old gods and beings of Ib, and a sign of leadership in Mnar. But on the night after it was set up in the temple, a terrible thing must have happened, for weird lights were seen over the lake, and in the morning the people found the idol gone, and the high priest Taran-ish lying dead, as from some fear unspeakable. And before he died, Taran-ish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite, with coarse, shaky strokes, the sign of doom. After Taran-ish, there were many high priests in Sarnath, but never was the sea-green stone idol found, and many centuries came and went, wherein Sarnath prospered exceedingly, so that only priests and old women remembered what Taran-ish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite. Betwixt Sarnath and the city of Larnek arose a caravan route, and the precious metals from the earth were exchanged for other metals, and rare cloths, and jewels, and books, and tools for artificers, and all things of luxury that are known to the people who dwell along the winding river Ai and beyond. So Sarnath waxed mighty, and learned, and beautiful, and sent forth conquering armies to subdue the neighboring cities, and in time there sate upon the throne in Sarnath the kings of all the land of Mnar and of many lands adjacent. The wonder of the world and the pride of all mankind was Sarnath the Magnificent. Of polished desert-quarried marble were its walls, in height 30 cubits and in breadth 75, so that chariots might pass each other as men drave them along the top. For full 500 stadia did they run, being open only on the side toward the lake, where green stone seawall kept back the waves that rose oddly once a year at the festival of the destroying of Ib. In Sarnath were 50 streets from the lake to the gates of the caravans, and 50 more intersecting them. With onyx they were paved, save those whereon the horses and camels and elephants trod, which were paved with granite. And the gates of Sarnath were as many as the landward ends of the streets, each of bronze, and flanked by the figures of lions and elephants, carven from some stone no longer known among men. The houses of Sarnath were of glazed brick and chalcedony, each having its walled garden and crystal lakelet. With strange art were they builded, for no other city had houses like them, and travelers from Thra and Larnek and Cathedron marveled at the shining domes wherewith they were surmounted. But more marvelous still were the palaces and the temples, and the gardens made by Zokar, the olden king. There were many palaces, the least of which were mightier than any in Thra, or Larnek, or Cathedron. So high were they, that one within might sometimes fancy himself beneath only the sky. Yet when lighted with torches dipped in the oil of Dothr, their walls shewed vast paintings of kings and armies, of a splendor at once inspiring and stupefying to the beholder. Many were the pillars of the palaces, all of tinted marble, and carven into designs of surpassing beauty. And in most of the palaces the floors were mosaics of beryl, and lapis lazuli, and sardonyx, and carbuncle, and other choice materials, so disposed that the beholder might fancy himself walking over the beds of the rarest flowers. And there were likewise fountains, which cast scented waters about in pleasing jets, arranged with cunning art. Outshining all others was the palace of the kings of Mnar, and of the lands adjacent. On a pair of golden, crouching lions rested the throne, many steps above the gleaming floor, and it was wrought of one piece of ivory, though no man who lives knows whence so vast a piece could have come. In that palace there were also many galleries, and many amphitheaters, where lions and men and elephants battled at the pleasure of the kings. Sometimes the amphitheaters were flooded with water conveyed from the lake in mighty aqueducts, and then were enacted stirring sea fights or combats betwixt swimmers and deadly marine things. Lofty and amazing were the 17 tower-like temples of Sarnath, fashioned of a bright, multicolored stone not known elsewhere. A full 1,000 cubits high stood the greatest among them, wherein the high priests dwelt, with a magnificence scarce less than that of the kings. On the ground were halls as vast and splendid as those of the palaces, where gathered throngs in worship of Zolkalar and Tamish and Loban, the chief gods of Sarnath, whose incense-enveloped shrines were as the thrones of monarchs. Not like the icons of other gods were those of Zolkalar and Tamish and Loban, for so close to life were they that one might swear the graceful bearded gods themselves sate on the ivory thrones. And up the unending steps of shining zircon was the tower chamber, wherefrom the high priests looked out over the city and the plains and the lake by day,
and the cryptic moon and significant stars and planets, and other reflections in the lake by night. Here was done the very secret and ancient rite in detestation of Bakrug, the water lizard. And here rested the altar of chrysolite, which bore the doom scroll of Taran-ish. Wonderful likewise were the gardens made by Zokhar, the Olden King. In the center of Sarnath they lay, covering a great space and encircled by a high wall, and they were surmounted by a mighty dome of glass, through which shone the sun, and moon, and stars and planets when it was clear, and from which were hung fulgent images of the sun, and moon, and stars and planets when it was not clear. In summer, the gardens were cooled with fresh, odorous breezes skillfully wafted by fans, and in winter they were heated with concealed fires, so that in those gardens it was always spring. There ran little streams over bright pebbles, dividing meads of green and gardens of many hues, and spanned by a multitude of bridges. Many were the waterfalls in their courses, and many were the little lakelets into which they expanded. Over the streams and lakelets rode white swans, whilst the music of rare birds chimed in with the melody of the waters. In ordered terraces rose the green banks, adorned here and there with bowers of vines and sweet blossoms, and seats and benches of marble and porphyry, and there were many small shrines and temples where one might rest or pray to small gods. Each year there was celebrated in Sarnath the feast of the destroying of Ib, at which time wine, song, dancing, and merriment of every kind abounded. Great honors were then paid to the shades of those who had annihilated the odd ancient beings, and in the memory of those beings, and of their elder gods, was derided by dancers and lutanists, crowned with roses from the gardens of Zokhar. And the kings would look out over the lake and curse the bones of the dead that lay beneath it. At first the high priests liked not these festivals, for there had descended amongst them queer tales of how the sea-green icon had vanished, and how Taran-ish had died from fear and left a warning. And they said that from their high tower they sometimes saw lights beneath the waters of the lake. But as many years passed without calamity, even the priests laughed and cursed, and joined in the orgies of the feasters. Indeed, had they not themselves, in their high tower, often performed the very ancient and secret rite in detestation of Bakrug, the water lizard, and 1,000 years of riches and delight passed over Sarnath, wonder of the world and pride of all mankind. Gorgeous beyond thought was the feast of the 1,000th year of the destroying of Ib. For a decade had it been talked of in the land of Manar, and as it grew nigh, there came to Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants men from Thra, Larnek, and Cathedron, and all the cities of Manar, and the lands beyond. Before the marble walls, on the appointed night, were pitched the pavilions of princes, and the tents of travelers, and all the shore resounded with the song of happy revelers. Within his banquet hall reclined Nargis High, the king, drunken with ancient wine from the vaults of conquered Pnath, and surrounded by feasting nobles and hurrying slaves. There were eaten many strange delicacies at the feast, peacocks from the isles of Nariel in the Middle Ocean, young goats from the distant hills of Implan, heels of camels from the Benazic desert, nuts and spices of Cathadrian groves, and pearls from the wave-washed metal dissolved in the vinegar of Thra. Of sauces, there were an untold number, prepared by the subtlest cooks in all Mnar, and suited to the palate of every feaster. But most prized of all the viands were the great fishes from the lake, each of vast size, and served up on golden platters, set with rubies and diamonds. Whilst the king and his nobles feasted within the palace, and viewed the crowning dish as it awaited them on golden platters, others feasted elsewhere. In the tower of the great temple, the priests held revels, and in pavilions without the walls the princes of neighboring lands made merry. And it was High Priest Gnai Ka who first saw the shadows that descended from the gibbous moon into the lake, and the damnable green mists that arose from the lake to meet the moon, and to shroud in a sinister haze the towers and the domes of fated Sarnath. Thereafter those in the towers and without the walls beheld strange lights on the water, and saw that the grey rock Akurion, which was wont to rear high above it near the shore, was almost submerged. And fear grew vaguely yet swiftly, so that the princes of Larnek and of Far Rokal took down and folded their tents and pavilions, and departed for the River Eye, though they scarce knew the reason for their departing. Then, close to the hour of midnight, all the bronze gates of Sarnath burst open, and emptied forth a frenzied throng that blackened the plain, so that all the visiting princes and travelers fled away in fright. For on the faces of this throng was writ a madness born of horror unendurable, and on their tongues were words so terrible that no hearer paused for proof. Men whose eyes were wild with fear shrieked aloud of the sight within the king's banquet hall, where through the windows were seen no longer the forms of Nargis High and his nobles and slaves, but a horde of indescribable, green, voiceless things, with bulging eyes, pouting, flabby lips, and curious ears. Things which danced horribly, bearing in their paws golden platters set with rubies and diamonds, containing uncouth flames. And the princes and travelers, as they fled from the doomed city of Sarnath, on horses and camels, looked again upon the mist-begetting lake, and saw the grey rock Akurion was quite submerged. Through all the land of Mnar and the lands adjacent spread the tales of those who had fled from Sarnath, and caravans sought that accursed city and its precious metals no more. It was long ere any traveler went thither, and even then only the brave and adventurous young men of distant Felona dared make the journey. Adventurous young men of yellow hair and blue eyes, who are no kin to the land of Mnar. These men indeed went to the lake to view Sarnath, but though they found the vast still lake itself, and the grey rock Akurion which rears high above it near the shore, they beheld not the wonder of the world, and pride of all mankind. Where once had risen walls of 300 cubits and towers yet higher, now stretched only the marshy shore, and where once dwelt 50 millions of men, now crawled only the detestable, green, water lizard. Not even the mines of precious metal remained, for doom had come to Sarnath. But half buried in the rushes was spied a curious green idol of stone, an exceedingly ancient idol coated with seaweed and chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug, the great water lizard. That idol, enshrined in the high temple at Larnek, was subsequently worshipped
beneath the gibbous moon, throughout the land of Mnar.
Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers, with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in twilight groves of grotesque gigantic and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken, and yet I am strangely content and cling desperately to those sear memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used something to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the outmost access tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partially ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive, but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decayed like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strode some of the stone crypts deep down amongst the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in many of the moldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own, for although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the useful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth, because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I'd read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went farther from the castle, the shade grew denser, and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So, through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky, and at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it was better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister, with startled bats whose wings made no noise, but more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress. For climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill as of haunted and vulnerable mold assaulted me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure that I might peer out and above and try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand to test the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the shimmy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the nonce end, since the slab was the trapdoor of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower. No doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed on the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, but hoped, when necessary, to pry it open again. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursing branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might look out for the first time upon the sky and the moon and stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment so many aeons cut off from the castle below. Then unexpectedly my hand came upon a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiselings. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength, I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known, for shining tranquility through an ornate grating of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams and in vague visions I dared not call memories. Fancy now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle. I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most diabolical of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable, nothing I'd before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me on a level through the grating nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church, whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic cravings for light, and not even the frantic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome, latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch of that region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river with crumbling mossy masonry, told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a veritable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar yet full of perplexed strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I've never seemingly heard human speech before and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections, others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping, as I did so, from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I've ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and invoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted. But when I moved toward one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there. A hint of motion beyond the golden arch doorway leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly. And then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation, the putrid dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world, yet to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent tapestry on the human shape, and in its moldly disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much so to make a feeble effort towards flight. A backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred and shewed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing. Those hideous, hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the foetid apparition which pressed so closely, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle and the trees, and recognized the altered edifice of which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos, there is balm as well as bitterness, and that balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and in the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable, but but I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle and the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nefrenka, in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadoth by the Nile. I knew that light is not for me, save for that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save for the unnamed feasts of Nitocris beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although Nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and amongst those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to that abomination within the great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched the cold and unyielding surface of polished glass.
In November 1927, H.P. Lovecraft sent a letter to Donald Wandre based on a dream that he had. Later, in 1941, J. Chapman Misk transformed the letter into a story. He did not change much, just added a bit to the beginning and a bit to the end. This is that story. The Thing in the Moonlight, written by H.P. Lovecraft and J. Chapman Misk in 1941. Morgan is not a literary man. In fact, he cannot speak English with any degree of coherency. That is what makes me wonder about the words he wrote, though others have laughed. He was alone the evening it happened. Suddenly, the unconquerable urge to write came over him, and taking pen in hand, he wrote the following. My name is Howard Phillips. I live at 66 College Street in Providence, Rhode Island. On November 24th, 1927, for I know not even what the year may be now, I fell asleep and dreamed, since when I have been unable to awaken. My dream began in a dank, reed-choked marsh that lay under a gray autumn sky, with a rugged cliff of lichen-crusted stone rising to the north. Impelled by some obscure quest, I ascended a rift or cleft in this beetling precipice, noting as I did so the black mouths of many fearsome burrows extending from both walls into the depths of the stony plateau. At several points, the passage was roofed over by the choking upper parts of the narrow fissure, these places being exceeding dark and forbidding the perception of such burrows as may have existed there. In one such dark space, I felt conscious of a singular ascension of fright, as if some subtle and bodiless emanation from the abyss were engulfing my spirit, but the blackness was too great for me to perceive the source of my alarm. At length I emerged upon a tableland of moss-grown rock and scanty soil, lit by a faint moonlight which had replaced the expiring orb of the day. Casting my eyes about, I beheld no living object, but was sensible of a very peculiar stirring far below me, amongst the whispering rushes of the pestilential swamp I had lately quitted. After walking for some distance, I encountered the rusty tracks of a street railway, and the worm-eaten poles which still held the limp and sagging trolley wire. Following this line, I soon came upon a yellow vestibuled car numbered 1852, of a plain, double-trucked type, common from 1900 to 1910. It was untenanted, but evidently ready to start, the trolley being on the wire and the air brake now and then throbbing beneath the floor. I boarded it and looked vainly for the light switch, noting as I did so the absence of the controller handle, which thus implied the brief absence of the motorman. Then I sat down, in one of the cross seats of the vehicle. Presently, I heard a swishing in the sparse grass toward the left, and saw the dark forms of two men looming up in the moonlight. They had the regulation caps of a railway company, and I could not doubt but that they were conductor and motorman. Then one of them sniffed with singular sharpness and raised his face to howl to the moon. The other dropped on all fours to run toward the car. I leaped up at once and raced madly out of that car and across endless leagues of plateau till exhaustion forced me to stop. Doing this not because the conductor had dropped on all fours, but because the face of the motorman was a mere white cone, tapering to one blood-red tentacle. I was aware that I only dreamed, but the very awareness was not pleasant. Since that fearful night, I have prayed only for awakening. It has not come. Instead, I have found myself an inhabitant of this terrible dream world. That first night gave way to dawn, and I wandered aimlessly over the lonely swamplands. When night came, I still wandered, hoping for awakening. But suddenly I parted the weeds and saw before me the ancient railway car, and to one side, a cone-faced thing lifted its head, and in the streaming moonlight, howled strangely. It has been the same each day. Night takes me always to that place of horror. I have tried not moving with the coming nightfall, but I must walk in my slumber, for I always awaken with the thing of dread howling before me in the pale moonlight, and I turn and flee madly. God, when will I awaken? That is what Morgan wrote. I would go to 66 College Street in Providence, but I fear for what I might find there. The White Ship by H.P. Lovecraft, written in 1919. I am Basil Elton, keeper of the North Point light that my father and grandfather kept before me. Far from the shore stands the gray lighthouse above sunken, slimy rocks that are seen when the tide is low, but unseen when the tide is high. Past that beacon for a century have swept the majestic barks of the seven seas. In the days of my grandfather there were many, in the days of my father not so many, and now there are so few that I sometimes feel strangely alone, as though I were the last man on our planet. From far shores came those white-sailed argosies of old, from far eastern shores, where warm suns shine, and sweet odors linger about strange gardens and gay temples. The old captains of the sea came often to my grandfather and told him of these things, which in turn he told to my father, and my father told to me in the long autumn evenings when the wind howled eerily from the east. And I have read more of these things, and of many things besides, in the books men gave me when I was young and filled with wonder. But more wonderful than the lore of old men and the lore of books is the secret lore of the ocean. Blue, green, gray, white or black, smooth, ruffled or mountainous, that ocean is not silent. All my days have I watched it and listened to it, and I know it well. At first it told me only the plain little tales of calm beaches and near ports. But within the years it grew more friendly, and spoke of other things, of things more strange and more distant in space and in time. Sometimes, at twilight, the gray vapors of the horizon have parted to grant me glimpses of the ways beyond, and sometimes at night, the deep waters of the sea have grown clear and phosphorescent to grant me glimpses of the ways beneath. And these glimpses have been as often of the ways that were, and the ways that might be, as of the ways that are. For ocean is more ancient than the mountains, and freighted with the memories and the dreams of time. Out of the south it was that the white ship used to come when the moon was full and high in the heavens. Out of the south it would glide very smoothly and silently over the sea, and whether the sea was rough or calm, and whether the wind was friendly or adverse, it would always guide smoothly and silently, its sails distant, and its long strange tiers of oars moving rhythmically. One night, I espied upon the deck a man, bearded and robed, and he seemed to beckon me to embark for fair unknown shores. Many times afterwards I saw him under the full moon, and ever did he beckon me. Very brightly did the moon shine on the night I answered the call, and I walked out over the waters to the white ship on a bridge made of moonbeams. The man who had beckoned now spoke a welcome to me, in a soft language I seemed to know well, and the hours were filled with the soft songs of the oarsmen as we glided away into a mysterious south, golden with the glow of that full, mellow moon. And when the day dawned rosy and effulgent, I beheld the green shore of far lands, bright and beautiful, and to me unknown. Up from the sea rose lordly terraces of verdure, tree-studded, and shewing here and there the gleaming white roofs and colonnades of strange temples. As we drew nearer the green shore, the bearded man told me of that land, the land of Zar, where dwell all the dreams and thoughts of beauty that come to men once and then are forgotten. And when I looked upon the terraces again, I saw that what he said was true, for among the sights before me were many things I had once seen through the mists beyond the horizon, and in the phosphorescent depths of the ocean. There, too, were forms and fantasies more splendid than any I had ever known. The visions of young poets who died in want before the world could learn of what they had seen and dreamed. But we did not set foot upon the sloping meadows of Zar, for it is told that he who treads them may never more return to his native shore. As the white ship sailed silently away from the templed terraces of Zar, we beheld on the distant horizon ahead the spires of a mighty city, and the bearded man said to me, "This is Thalarion, the city of 1,000 wonders, wherein reside all those mysteries that man has strived in vain to fathom." And I looked again, at closer range, and saw that the city was greater than any city I had known or dreamed of before. Into the sky the spires of its temples reached, so that no man might behold their peaks. And far back beyond the horizon stretched the grim gray walls, over which one might spy only a few roofs, weird and ominous, yet adorned with rich friezes and alluring sculptures. I yearned mightily to enter this fascinating yet repellent city, and besought the bearded man to land me at the stone pier by the huge cavern gate, Acriel. But he gently denied my wish, saying, "Into Thalarion, the city of 1,000 wonders, many have passed, but none returned. Therein walk only daemons and mad things that are no longer men. And the streets are white with the unburied bones of those who have looked upon the Eidolon Lathi that reigns over the city." So the white ship sailed on past the walls of Thalarion, and followed for many days a southward flying bird, whose glossy plumage matched the sky out of which it had appeared. Then came we to a pleasant coast gay with blossoms of every hue, where as far inland as we could see basked lovely groves and radiant arbors beneath a meridian sun. From bowers beyond our view came bursts of song and snatches of lyric harmony, interspersed with faint laughter so delicious that I urged the rowers onward in my eagerness to reach the scene. And the bearded man spoke no word, but watched me as we approached the lily-lined shore. Suddenly a wind blowing from over a flowery meadows and leafy woods brought a scent at which I trembled. The wind grew stronger, and the air was filled with the lethal charnel odor of plague-stricken towns and uncovered cemeteries. And as we sailed madly away from the damnable coast, the bearded man spoke at last, saying, "This is Zura, the land of pleasures unattained." So once more the white ship followed the bird of heaven, over warm, blessed seas fanned by caressing, aromatic breezes. Day after day, and night after night did we sail. And when the moon was full, we would listen to soft songs of the oarsmen, sweet as on that distant night when we sailed away from my far native land. And it was by moonlight that we anchored at last in the harbor of Sane Nil, which is guarded by twin headlands of crystal that rise from the sea and meet in a resplendent arch. This is the land of fancy, and we walked to the verdant shore upon a golden bridge of moonbeams. In the land of Sane Nil, there is neither time nor space, neither suffering nor death, and there I dwelt for many eons. Green are the groves and pastures, bright and fragrant the flowers, blue and musical the streams, cool and clear the fountains, and stately and gorgeous the temples, castles, and cities of Sane Nil. Of that land there is no bound, for beyond each vista of beauty rises another more beautiful. Over the countryside and amidst the splendor of cities rove at will the happy folk, of whom all are gifted with unmarred grace and unalloyed happiness. For the eons that I dwelt there, I wandered blissfully through gardens where quaint pagodas peep from pleasing clumps of bushes, and where the white walks are bordered with delicate blossoms. I climbed gentle hills, from whose summits I could see entrancing panoramas of loveliness, with steepled towns nestling in verdant valleys, and with the golden domes of gigantic cities glittering on infinitely distant horizon. And I viewed by moonlight the sparkling sea, the crystal headlands, and the placid harbor wherein lay anchored the white ship. It was against the full moon one night, in the immemorial year of Tharp, that I saw outlined the beckoning form of the celestial bird, and felt the stirrings of unrest. Then I spoke with the bearded man, and told him of my new yearnings to depart for remote Cthulhu, which no man hath seen, but which all believe lie beyond the basalt pillars of the west. It is the land of hope, and in it shine the perfect ideals of all that we know elsewhere, or at least so men relate. But the bearded man said to me, "Beware of those perilous seas, wherein men say Cthulhu lies. In Sona Nil there is no pain nor death, but who can tell what lies beyond the basalt pillars of the west?" Nathless, in the next full moon, I boarded the white ship, and with the reluctant bearded man left the happy harbor for untraveled seas. And the bird of heaven flew before, and led us toward the basalt pillars of the west. But this time the oarsmen sang no soft songs under the full moon. In my mind, I would often picture the unknown land of Cthulhu, with its splendid groves and palaces, and would wonder what new delights there awaited me. Cthulhu, I would say to myself, is the abode of gods and the land of unnumbered cities of gold. Its forests are of aloe and sandalwood, even as the fragrant groves of Cameron, and among the trees flutter gay birds, sweet with song. On the green and flowery mountains of Cthulhu stand temples of pink marble, rich with caravan and painted glories, and having in their courtyards cool fountains of silver, where purl with ravishing music the scented waters that come from the grotto-born river Narg. And the cities of Cthulhu are cinctured with golden walls, and their pavements also are of gold. In the gardens of these cities are strange orchards and perfumed lakes, whose beds are of coral and amber. At night, the streets and gardens are lit with gay lanterns, fashioned from the three-colored shell of the tortoise, and here resound the soft notes of the singer and the lutenist. And the houses of the cities of Cthulhu are all palaces, each built over a fragrant canal, bearing the waters of the sacred Narg. Of marble and porphyry are the houses, and roofed with glittering gold that reflects the rays of the sun and enhances the splendor of the cities, as blissful gods view them from the distant peaks. Fairest of all is the palace of the great monarch Dorieb, who some say to be a demigod, and others a god. High is the palace of Dorieb, and many are the turrets of marble upon its walls. In its wide halls, many multitudes assemble, and here hang the trophies of the ages. And the roof is of pure gold, set upon tall pillars of ruby and azure, and having such carven figures of gods and heroes, that he who looks up to those heights seems to gaze upon the living Olympus. And the floor of the palace is of glass, under which flow cunningly lighted waters of the Narg, gay with gaudy fish, not beyond the bounds of the lovely Cthulhu. Thus I would speak to myself of Cthulhu, but ever would the bearded man warn me to turn back to the happy shores of San-Enil, for San-Enil is known of men, while none hath ever beheld Cthulhu. And on the 31st day that we followed the bird, we beheld the basalt pillars of the west. Shrouded in mist they were, so that no man might peer beyond them, or see their summits, which indeed some say reach even to the heavens. And the bearded man again implored me to turn back, but I heeded him not, for from the mists beyond the basalt pillars I fancied there came the notes of singer and lutenist, sweeter than the sweetest songs of San-Enil, and sounding mine own praises, the praises of me, who had voyaged far under the full moon, and dwelt in the land of fancy. So to the sound of melody the white ship sailed into the mist betwixt the basalt pillars of the west. And when the music ceased and the mist lifted, we beheld not the land of Cthulhu, but a swift rushing, resistless sea, over which our helpless bark was borne toward some unknown goal. Soon to our ears came the distant thunder of falling waters, and to our eyes appeared on the far horizon ahead the titanic spray of a monstrous cataract, wherein the oceans of the world drop down to abysmal nothingness. Then did the bearded man say to me with tears on his cheek, "We have rejected the beautiful land of San-Enil, which we may never behold again. The gods are greater than men, and they have conquered." And I closed my eyes before the crash that I knew would come, shutting out the sight of the celestial bird which flapped its mocking blue wings over the brink of the torrent. Out of the crash came darkness, and I heard the shrieking of men, and of things which were not men. From the east, tempestuous winds arose and chilled me as I crouched on the slab of damp stone which had risen beneath my feet. Then, as I heard another crash, I opened my eyes, and beheld myself upon the platform of that lighthouse, from whence I had sailed so many eons ago. In the darkness below, there loomed the vast blurred outlines of a vessel, breaking up on the cruel rocks. And as I glanced out over the waste, I saw that the light had failed for the first time since my grandfather had assumed its care. And in the later watches of the night, when I went within the tower, I saw on the wall a calendar, which still remained as when I had left it at the hour I sailed away. With dawn, I descended to the tower and looked for wreckage upon the rocks. But what I found was only this: a strange, dead bird, whose hue was as of the azure sky, and a single shattered spar of a whiteness greater than that of the wave tips or of the mountain snow. And thereafter the ocean told me its secrets no more, and though many times since has the moon shone full and high in the heavens, the white ship from the south never came again.